just to get started, this is the second city charter study session. I won't go too much into what we talked about before, but I do notice that there are a couple new people here, and hopefully we can just cover the very basics of the charter so we don't have to go into that, and everything hopefully will also make sense with it. So I just first want to start off the meeting with our non-negotiables, same as last time. And these are the ones that Accountability for Dearborn uses in their meetings. Racism exists. Lived experiences are valid. We value impact over intent. A person can be both the oppressed and the oppressor, and social barriers are human-made. So we start out talking about the non-negotiables because as the city charter sessions were advertised, we're hoping to make a city charter that is something that is anti-racist, something that is really serving our communities and allowing us to have a more democratized city, while also making sure that we are enacting policies that are not hurting different communities. So tonight's intention setting, a little bit of the same thing. So I want to start imagining what kinds of things we could do with a charter that supports a safe and a caring anti-racist community. I'm going to review some rules and procedures for charter revision. So as we're going a little bit closer, hopefully this will be a little more helpful to those who are thinking of running for charter commission, or maybe it'll inspire you to run for it or find a friend that you think would be great for it. There will be a lot of great people for this. And then I want to talk a little bit about current events, because there has been a lot of revision going on for the Detroit City Charter, and the matters went up to the Michigan Appeals Court, and they're likely going to go to the Supreme Court. We'll talk about it a little later, but regardless, that's going to have an impact very much on how we are able to develop the charter. So last time we were here, we talked about what a charter looks like, what the Dearborn City Charter looks like and how it's structured. So in the charter, it outlines our form of government, and it starts to outline who the mayor is, what the mayor's role is, who the city council is, what the city council's role is, the police, the fire department, etc. And when I was doing research for this, there seems to be a point during many charter revisions, especially in Michigan, where we have to address the form of our government. So that's a little bit different. So having a mayor and having a city council is pretty standard. And this is something we're very unlikely to change in our community. But the emphasis that we have on the power of our mayor or our city council can be changed through the charter. So the Dearborn government, so I got this from a Wikipedia search. If you just look up the city of Dearborn, it has a little tab on the side and it says that we're a strong mayor council city. And that doesn't explain too much, but I will go into a little more detail. There are different types of governments that you can have in your city. So you can have something that is strong mayor city council, which means that there's a lot of power concentrated with the mayor or with the council. You can drop off the council, it can be a strong mayor city. And one of the factors that goes into what kind of government, if you want a strong mayor government, has to do with your population size. It has to do with how big the city is, and a little bit of whether you consider it to be major or a major city or a small city, regardless of population size. So I want you to think about that in terms of, so Dearborn has, they're not a large city in terms of population necessarily, if you're talking about it like across the United States, but in terms of having a big impact, the Dearborn city has a lot of power. And you can think of it like that. It's like a large city in comparison to other cities in Metro Detroit in terms of how much power it has. So we can start thinking about the different ways that we know of Dearborn's impact in the surrounding communities and just in Michigan in general. So this is not something that has to be this way. This little paragraph I took, it says as to form. This is taken from the Michigan Municipal League that has a handbook for city, for how to revise your city charter. And I'll share it with you later, but this is where I got most of my information from. Let me see if I can change it. So there are different types of mayoral systems that we can have. And in Michigan, there are actually several. And you might not really realize it until you start looking at other people's city charters. But for example, I'll start talking about this mayor council thing. It means that there's an executive mayor and a separately elected city council. This is very, this is what we have, very ordinary to us. And you can have two different forms of this mayor council system. You have a weak mayor, which is something that they usually have for small towns, and strong mayor, which is usually for major cities. And so we fall under here. And then there's a council manager. And this is a little bit different. They operate more like the city council has the leadership role in this city. And they're responsible for doing all the legislative functions as they would in a regular mayor council one, but they have someone who oversees what they do to implement policies. I'm at Michigan State right now. This is the kind of thing that they have in East Lansing. So they have what's called a city administrator who acts like a CEO that acts out what the city council does. There's also a mayor, but I just wanted to kind of give you the broad overview. Now, this is one of the most popular ways that people manage their city across the United States. And it can be applied in small and big cities, but it's, there's a lot of flexibility and a lot of hybrid options. And so this might seem a little bit abstract. There is a whole point to all of this, I promise. But the mayor council way of running things tends to concentrate the power between the mayor and the council. And I think if we think about what's going on in Dearborn and the development of Dearborn's government, we can definitely see this this type of government. The mayor, for example, proposes a budget in Dearborn, and the city council they get to amend it, they can revise it, but they can't write necessarily the budget, but they can approve and they can decline things. So really the mayor is setting out the policies a lot of the time, and then the legislative branch, which is our city council, they have a lot of power, but it's ultimately kind of determined by the mayor. And even though most of our policies are kind of set in stone, we've done the same thing several years after one another. It's this, I just want to emphasize that that's where our power is concentrated. So Dearborn's like this, Livonia's like this, and Detroit, some of the other cities I listed here. So that's why I wanted to talk about what major cities are. They're pretty big cities for Michigan. So one of the characteristics of this mayor council thing is that people argue that it allows for a lot of dynamic political leadership, even though I don't exactly, we can kind of guess what that means, but it's how they can have this like robust public official kind of image going on. And so for us, it might work. This is something to think about, but and honestly, there are a lot of similarities between this first mayor council thing and this council manager I'm going to talk about in a minute. But if you, for example, or I are discontent with the way that the mayor and the city council are handling desires to change the community, I think some of us might be facing those obstacles now in different things. It's good to think about the fact that like that is the way that the city is run, and the fact that this mayor council kind of maintains most of the power. So since we're kind of familiar with it, there's not that much we need to go into, but the council manager is the second option below. And this is the way that cities like Ann Arbor, East Lansing, ones that usually have a lower population size, obviously because there's 2 universities there, and then Grand Rapids and Sterling Heights, even though Grand Rapids is a pretty big city. And I would argue Novi is pretty big too. You would think that maybe they wouldn't have this kind of, they wouldn't have this type of system going on. And Trenton also has a city manager, as Jerry mentioned. So here, this council is hiring professionally trained manager to oversee the delivery of public services. And the mayor has a much much weaker role here. It's not weak mayor, but it's much weaker, right? So they can still, they're a little bit more of like a figurehead. They're not somebody who is making a lot of the policy decisions, but they can, as I've written here, solicit citizen views and facilitate communication. The advantage to these types of council manager approaches is that you have a government that is not bound so much by the rules and the laws and the policies that the mayors and the councils have to have, because you have this manager thing. So I guess a good way to think of it is potentially, you know how there are private corporations and then there are like public institutions. The private one would be more like the council manager, where you're having, you have like a little bit more flexibility in like what the leadership roles look like. But then again, there's also the difference between like public and private institutions is that there are less standards maybe that someone is following. Now, it's kind of hard sometimes to see the difference just from like knowing a city, but this is stuff that's outlined in the charter. So for example, if you're looking at Ann Arbor and East Lansing, they're going to have to talk about the roles of those administrators that the council hires, whereas we don't have that because we don't have this form of government. They also usually have 5, 7, or 9 council members. So in a way that's kind of similar to us, it's similar numbers. Well, let me go back to this. So the reason I dropped all this information about the form of the government in Dearborn is that this needs to be determined usually at the outcome, and maybe it won't even be a conversation in Dearborn, but it is important to think about what the drawbacks are of this kind of mayor-council situation and what the advantages are of that also, and same with council manager. So if we're trying to make a city that is more representative of the people who are less represented in city government, and you could argue that East Dearborn and South End are less represented in the government, how could we think of a more hybrid approach to it, where we have something like these more flexible council manager type of deals, where we have somebody to oversee the delivery of public services and enact or implement the policies that the city council is doing in order to get the things done that we want to. So, I really think this private versus public might be a good way to think about it, because usually you can see the different advantages there. That's something we're all a little bit more familiar with. We'll go back to it during the discussion. So, and then another thing that you will learn if you are on the commission, I am absolutely sure of, is this Home Rule Cities Act. And so this has been something that has been talked about a little bit in Dearborn, but also extremely a lot in Detroit, because no matter what, a city charter has to follow all of the rules and procedures of this Home Rule Cities Act. I talked a little bit about this at the first one. So at the first session, this specifies certain requirements that every city must contain within its city charter, which will be in the following slides. And it provides for numerous optional charter provisions. I won't go into detail on those because we have it's going to just vary so much from city to city. It would just take too long to cover in this section, but it's just different standard language you can use in the charter. It's nothing super interesting, but it's all there. And in general, any power that is not specifically prohibited by any other law for a city is you can use in the city charter. Of course, you're not going to know that, but as you're going through the city revision or the charter revision process, there's a lot of legal review that's going to be going on anyway. So, you don't have to necessarily know the constitutionality, but somebody's going to be looking at that for you. And it's going to be a lawyer. So the mandatory charter provisions of the Home Rule City Act, the way that they do this is they kind of have these sections that are required in every charter. We have these. We have the election of the mayor, the council, the clerk, etc. Just important provisions that regardless of what kind of government you want to have in your city, you have to have these things. There's sample language there, but pretty much anything that other cities have used, this is also good for us. to model off of. We can skip this because it kind of goes over that, but we have to have a council, a mayor, clerk, treasurer, attorney, assessor, and then you have an option for others, for other types of officers. This also looks very familiar to us. So if you ever wanted to look at kind of a really nice and interesting city charter, you look at Southfield and also Ann Arbor. They have, they have these ordinances, all these things listed out in all their sections, but the way that it is organized is significantly better than ours, I think. And it describes the purpose of all of these things. I think it's a much more legible for a regular citizen to be reading. So when the Charter Commission is going over this new revision, at the end and along the way, if you're just, for example, if you were proposing an amendment, either way, amendment or revision for the charter has to get approved by the governor. And what happens is that the draft document gets sent to the governor reviews it, and the attorney general also has a look at it. What they're looking for is that you are following with different constitutional law practices, you're complying with all the required provisions, you're not putting in any of the prohibited provisions that are in the Home Rule City Act. I don't think normally this is too big of an issue, but this governor's review has become it can be an easy way to block certain things in the charter if they don't want it to go through. So this is a little bit out of place and I didn't know where to put it, but I want to take a look at this one chart that was provided by the Michigan Municipal League, and it talks about the characteristics of charter commissions in the state of Michigan. Obviously, this is a little bit older, but we can probably expect to see very similar demographics. So typically the people who are writing our city charters are, as the chart's saying, they're usually men, white, college degrees, median age of 51 to 60. And while that might be representative of some of the cities, it's it's obvious that not every city is represented that way. And so when we're looking at like who's running for city charter commission, I think it's important to definitely highlight voices and people who are running that maybe reflect what our community is looking at. I think that's a really important thing to think about when we're talking about the creating an anti-racist charter. No city I know of is 75% male, right? So like the charters don't the commissions don't necessarily represent us in that way, but I guess I meant yeah, good point, Beth. But anyway, it's something that you can see impacts the way that the charter is going to probably come out for people. Okay, and these are great resources. They're very long. The Charter Revision Handbook is like 300 pages, and this So You Want a New Charter, it's also pretty interesting. It mostly talks about these different forms of government that I was talking about earlier. So hopefully that helped, and when you read it, it might be a little easier. I'll share it later. And before we get to the discussion part, this is extremely important, I think, for Dearborn to be looking at a little bit, if you haven't heard of the history. So in Detroit, their city charter was opened up for revision maybe 3 years ago. And they've been working on it over these 3 years. It's been, in some days, it can be very contentious, but they've had over like 500 proposed changes to it. They've had a number of activists, especially this Bill of Rights commission, who's like a group of activists that have been trying to implement what we don't have. It's called a Bill of Rights, and it's saying things like guaranteeing free water, affordable housing, public transit, a lot of things that are not guaranteed in Detroit. Not really necessarily guaranteed in any city, but it was more, I want to say it was, it didn't outline specifics all the way, but it was more of like a promise, right? Seems fairly reasonable. And these are things that, some cities have adopted in their ordinances somehow, or their city charters on their own. But they submitted this to the governor after the mayor was kind of fighting against. And the mayor was saying that if we guarantee all of these, essentially all of these changes, the affordable housing, the clean water, the city will go into bankruptcy. And that's obviously not a good, well, that's not a good outcome, but it's not a good perspective, because we have to think about where we want to allocate the resources for fundamental rights like that. But anyway, so what happened very recently within the last few days is that lawsuits have been started about this because the governor rejected the proposed changes recently that Detroit sent to the governor. And that's part of the requirements of the Home Rule City Act. Your governor has to approve it. And she turned it down for certain legal deficiencies, but didn't necessarily say a finding about this bankruptcy thing. And the attorney general also found this kind of strange finding that Whitmer's approval was not required. And that kind of is what set it off to the courts. So what the courts did is that they, on May 26th, the Michigan Court of Appeals upheld that the Home Rule Cities Act does not allow, the voters can't vote on this proposed charter unless the governor approves, essentially. And that was kind of the problem. Like, if they don't have to get the governor's approval, they can send it off to get voted on by the people, and the people kind of make the decision. But this could be, imagine, 3 years, we get to the end of like making our city charter, we incorporate things that sound amazing, like a Bill of Rights and stuff like that, and we still have to worry about kind of politics, like kind of stopping it a little bit. Like, if the mayor's not with it, and the governor doesn't approve, or it's not meeting these legal standards, there could be a big problem. And so the thing that many activists have been saying is that this has been a way that the mayor has tried to kind of block the changes, block the updates that people are doing. So depending on how this turns out, because I believe that they're going to bring it up to a higher court to make this final determination to the Supreme Court, it could very much shape the outcome of a city charter. For example, depending on who's like your mayor or something, could have a really strong input on it. And so the charter commission, the strength of it would be so diluted, it would be, I don't know. I could just imagine how demoralizing this is after all those fights you've already have to kind of get to this point. And if the Supreme Court decides something like that, it impacts us equally. So that's why I wanted to bring it up.